Last week, Attorney General Merrick Garland ordered the Bureau of Prisons to allow thousands of federal inmates that were released because of COVID to stay at home. Garland said in a statement, quote, "Thousands of people on home confinement have reconnected with their families, have found gainful employment, and have followed the rules." Garland's directive reverses a Trump administration decision that would have sent many of those released back to prison.
Now, this comes after House progressives called on Biden to commute the sentences of thousands and establish a review board for pending clemency. Progressive lawmakers wrote in a letter to Biden, quote, "We urge you to use your authority as president to immediately commute the sentences of the 4,000 people who, under the CARES Act, are currently on home confinement and at risk of being sent back to federal prison, and further to create an independent clemency board to review the more than 15,000 pending clemency petitions." Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman was one of those lawmakers who spearheaded the letter and joins us now to discuss recent developments. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, doesn't this experiment, not an experiment that was, willingly done, but because of COVID was conducted, doesn't it show that, there are people who are languishing in prisons who are not a danger to the community, who who already have been and will be rehabilitated into normal life? Doesn't it speak to the urgent need to move people who can be moved out of our prisons and keep them out?
Yes and yes, and we knew this even before the pandemic, but the pandemic required us to act in a different way. And one of the results of the pandemic was to try to de-incarcerate those individuals who were not a harm to society, who were low-level offenders, and to get them out of the prison system because of the spread of the pandemic. So we got a chance to look at, what happens when you do that? But generally speaking, yes, our whole criminal justice system is ripe for the kind of review as to what does it take to have someone respond to, pay for whatever infraction it is that they are accused of and convicted of. But what is rehabilitation? What is a second chance? And we saw by this situation right here that there were people in prison who were not a threat to anybody and who could be productive individuals in their communities and reconnect with their families. So yeah, there was a good outcome here.
How did progressives pull this off? Because there have been limited successes from Congress urging the Biden administration to do X, Y, or Z, from an executive level. What was different with this situation that enabled you and the kind of coalition behind you to get the attention of the administration and get them to actually change policy?
Well, I think, first of all, they recognized that upon release, those individuals were really vetted. They knew who they were letting out. And then that there were advocates that were supporting their allowing to remain at home, that they have the statistics show that there were very few, if any, serious violations, and that those individuals have reconnected with family and community and even found work to do from their homes. And so it was an opportunity for them to evaluate something that was in place.
Yeah, and if people are not violent, are not going, not in danger of reoffending, and we know that many of these people are not, then it doesn't make sense to have them in prison at all. It's a waste of public resources. It's costly to incarcerate, and also and then during the pandemic, it was literally dangerous to keep people in these close confined quarters. So can this moment be used as evidence that we can do so much more on this front? Not to suddenly flood our streets with violent or dangerous criminals. No one wants that. And if we did that, there would be a huge blowback and we would undo any of the progress we're making on this front. So how can we be, a little bit careful and a little bit cautious, but also get people who can be out of prison, back into their homes?
Well, one of the letters that I signed on to asked for an independent agency to look at clemency applications to see how to expedite that process and how to be uniform in that process. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that we've had a number of pieces of legislation that have either been passed or in the works called second chance legislation that looks at depopulating prisons of individuals who are not a danger to society or to their families or their communities or anything, who are in prison for low-level crimes, and that who could be reintegrated into their communities. Another thing that we need to look at is what happens when you're incarcerated. What is the actual preparation for coming back into society? And we recognize that people have a tendency to just sort of languish in prison. It doesn't necessarily prepare them to become citizens, contributing citizens once out. So here's the time when we can reevaluate our policies, our practices, the application of our resources. It costs a lot of money to incarcerate a person in prison. It costs less money to educate them and to prepare them to live a productive life.
And what mechanisms are there to take this quickly forward? Because as we sit here, there are hundreds of thousands of people who present no danger to their community, who could be eligible for home confinement. And given the kind of advances in surveillance technology that we've reported on a lot, kind of from a negative perspective, make it so that it really is very difficult for somebody who is in home confinement to violate that, which is going to help you with the kind of the political blowback that Robbie was talking about. So, is it the commuting power that the president has? Like, what needs to happen to move quickly on this, given that real people are being ground up by this on a daily basis?
So there are tens of thousands of individuals in prison right now that probably are eligible for clemency. And establishing an independent board is a good way to go and to get it to move expeditiously, which is something that government doesn't really do very well. But in this situation, we've got models that we can take from and implement. And number two is looking forward, how we address those individuals who have committed low-level crimes. What is the appropriate response to that? Is it a halfway house? Is it home confinement with surveillance mechanisms associated with them? Is it making sure that they're in job training programs and have responsibilities to report and to be where they're supposed to be? There are alternatives to incarceration. We are an over-incarceration country, and to be the sort of democracy, the civilized country we're supposed to be, we don't handle that issue well, and we need to reevaluate it, and we need to apply resources appropriately to making sure that we're keeping families together, we're keeping communities together.
How do your colleagues on the other side of the political spectrum, the Republican Party, how do they feel about this? Obviously there has been some bipartisan criminal justice reform. President Trump signed former President Trump signed the First Step Act, and touted it. Was proud of it. Yeah. Was something he was bragging about. But also there are concerns right now, not just among Republicans, but among everyone about crime, increasing crime, the kinds of things you're seeing in various places. So are you in conversation with people on the right about how we can do this, thoughtfully without blowback?
Well, we have individuals in the Republican caucus or conference who recognize that there are alternatives to these costly incarcerations that take place. I mean, we're very concerned, as they are concerned, about our application of resources. And they know that we don't necessarily get the biggest bang for the buck by putting people in prison and then letting them go at the end of their sentence, and they're not really ready to even integrate. So we need to look at these alternatives. And this situation that happened out of this pandemic is a great example of what can be done under the right circumstances, vetting the right people, putting together accountability systems, giving them assistance in finding jobs and reconnecting with their families. So we have a model to look at.
And as you know better than anybody, politics can often be emotional more than it can be rational. And so even as people might rationally understand that this suite of policies actually will lead to less violence in the streets and less crime. If there's an emotional kind of reaction around a surge in homicides, that people just push that aside and say, you know what the voters want now is to be tough on crime again. So are you noticing among your colleagues any loss of motivation or momentum behind the criminal justice reform movement because of the kind of clouded climate around the spike in homicides?
So I'm going to say that we're at a very interesting juncture in D.C. right now. We're sort of caught up in some other things that are happening. Obviously, the January 6th Commission, everything that's happened as a result of that, dealing with things like the laws that are being passed on states that are impairing voting rights opportunities, the infrastructure bills, all these other things. To be perfectly honest with you, I've not had a conversation about this issue specifically in quite a while, even though I've co-authored legislation with Cory Booker called the Second Chance Act, which goes beyond the first chance and looks more sort of comprehensively from the youth to the elderly, what we can do to make our system fairer and to be less costly. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. Unfortunately, we're kind of wrapped up in these things that we need to get done that are very urgent right now as well. But that doesn't mean we can't chew gum and walk at the same time. And so we're going to ask that the Department of Justice really look at the kinds of reforms that take place and make sense, and that cost less to the taxpayer, present healthier family units, which have been devastated by this over-incarceration that has taken place in this country in the first place.
Well, Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we will have more Rising right after this.